Canada is known as one of the world's most peaceful nations, but it was built through invasion, rebellion, forced displacement, and a struggle that nearly tore the country apart. France and Britain fought for its land, Indigenous nations were pushed aside, and Quebec later voted twice on whether to leave Canada. The second referendum failed by just 54,288 votes. How did this fragile collection of colonies survive and become the second largest country on Earth? This is the history of Canada. Long before Canada existed, the land was home to Indigenous peoples whose ancestors had lived across northern North America for roughly 15,000 years. As the ice sheets retreated, communities adapted to vastly different environments. In the Arctic, the ancestors of the Inuit built lives around marine mammals, caribou, and seasonal movement across sea ice. Along the Pacific coast, salmon and cedar supported permanent communities. On the prairies, nations followed and managed bison herds, while peoples around the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence cultivated corn, beans, and squash beside fortified towns. Farther north, hunting, fishing, and river travel sustained communities across the boreal forest. These societies were neither isolated nor politically simple. Trade routes carried copper, stone, shells, and other goods over enormous distances, while councils, alliances, laws, and kinship networks governed relations within and between nations. When Europeans arrived, they entered a continent whose political and economic systems were already centuries old. No single political system governed this immense region. Around the Great Lakes, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy united 5 nations, later 6, through a council that balanced collective decisions with the autonomy of each member nation. Nearby, the Wendat formed their own confederacy, while Anishinaabe communities used councils, kinship, and diplomacy to organize relations across a broad territory. Cree trading networks connected the northern forests and plains, and Inuit communities maintained knowledge and social systems adapted to Arctic life. On the northwest coast, hereditary leaders, clan ties, and ceremonial exchanges shaped wealthy societies supported by salmon and maritime trade. These nations traded, negotiated, and sometimes fought over territory, resources, and influence. Their rivalries mattered as much as their alliances, because Europeans would soon enter these existing political contests, rather than confront a single united population. The first known Europeans to establish a settlement arrived not as conquerors, but as Norse voyagers on the Atlantic coast. Around the year 1000, Norse sailors traveling from settlements in Greenland crossed the North Atlantic and established a small base at Lanceau Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of 8 timber and sod buildings, along with evidence of ironworking, the earliest known European settlement in North America. Yet the newcomers had not reached an empty land. Indigenous peoples had used the area for thousands of years, and communities connected to the ancestors of the Innu and Beothuk were active across the surrounding region. Whether they met the Norse at the site remains uncertain, although later Norse sagas describe encounters elsewhere in lands they called Vinland. The outpost was occupied only briefly and never developed into a lasting colony. Its abandonment meant that Europe's first known foothold in the region disappeared for centuries. When Europeans returned in growing numbers after 1497, they came not first for settlement, but for the immense fisheries of the Atlantic coast. In 1497, Italian navigator John Cabot, sailing under an English commission, crossed the North Atlantic and reached the coast of northeastern North America, although his exact landing place remains disputed. His voyage later supported England's claims in the region, but the immediate prize was not territory. Reports of waters crowded with cod attracted Basque, Portuguese, French, and English fishermen to Newfoundland and Labrador. By the early 16th century, ships were crossing the Atlantic each year, drying fish onshore or salting their catch at sea before returning to Europe. These seasonal camps brought Europeans into repeated contact with indigenous peoples, including the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq, producing trade, but eventually also competition and violence. The fisheries created the region's first lasting economic connection with Europe, yet they did not immediately produce large permanent colonies. France soon looked beyond the Atlantic coast toward the St. Lawrence River, where trade, territory, and a possible route into the continent promised even greater rewards. France's first sustained attempt to penetrate the continent came through Jacques Cartier. Commissioned by King Francis I, Cartier explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence in 1534, erected a cross at Gaspé, and claimed territory already inhabited by indigenous peoples. During a second voyage in 1535, he sailed up the St. Lawrence to Stadacona, near present-day Quebec City, and Hochelaga on the island of Montreal, proving that the river was a gateway into the interior. Relations with the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, however, deteriorated. After surviving winter and scurvy with indigenous assistance, Cartier seized Chief Donnacona and several others and carried them to France, where most died. In 1541, Cartier returned to establish a colony at Cap Rouge, but conflict, severe conditions, and worthless minerals mistaken for gold and diamonds doomed the project. Roberval's follow-up colony also failed. Cartier had mapped a route into the continent, but decades would pass before Samuel de Champlain transformed exploration into permanent settlement. After a disastrous winter at Île Sainte-Croix, Pierre Duguay de Mons and Samuel de Champlain moved their settlement to Port Royal, in Acadia, in 1605. Its farms and protected harbour created an early French foothold on the Atlantic coast, although the colony remained fragile. 3 years later, Champlain founded Quebec at a narrow point on the St. Lawrence River, where a fortified trading post could control access to the interior. Survival depended not only on supplies from France, but also on knowledge, trade, and military alliances with indigenous nations, especially the Innu, Algonquin, and Wendat. Through these relationships, French merchants gained access to the continental fur trade, while their allies sought support against rival powers, including the Haudenosaunee. Quebec was still a tiny settlement, vulnerable to hunger, disease, and European competition, yet it gave France a permanent base from which missionaries, traders, soldiers, and settlers would gradually build New France. During the 17th century, beaver pelts became the economic foundation of New France. In Europe, felt hats made from beaver fur were fashionable and valuable, creating demand that pulled French traders far beyond Quebec. Indigenous hunters supplied most pelts and controlled the rivers, portage routes, and commercial networks needed to move them. Wendat middlemen carried furs from the interior toward French posts, while Innu, Algonquin, and other nations exchanged pelts for metal tools, cloth, firearms, and additional European goods. Settlements such as Trois-Rivières and Montreal became important points in this expanding system, and French voyageurs and independent coureurs des bois pushed toward the Great Lakes. The trade created alliances and mixed communities, but it also spread epidemic disease, increased dependence on imported goods, and intensified competition over hunting territories and access to European markets. As beaver grew scarce in some regions, that competition became more violent, helping ignite the conflicts later known as the Beaver Wars. By the mid-17th century, competition for furs and access to European markets had escalated into the conflicts later known as the Beaver Wars. Armed with Dutch and later English firearms, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy sought to weaken rival trade networks and expand its influence westward. Epidemics had already devastated Wendat communities when Haudenosaunee attacks destroyed several of their settlements and missions in 1648 and 1649, dispersing much of the Wendat Confederacy. The Haudenosaunee also fought the Innu, Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and other nations, while France supplied its allies and eventually launched military expeditions against Haudenosaunee towns. Yet no power secured permanent control over the immense interior. In 1701, the Great Peace of Montreal brought New France and representatives of 39 indigenous nations into a broad settlement that reduced hostilities and restored trade. But peace did not end imperial competition. While France expanded through the Great Lakes, England was building a rival commercial empire around Hudson Bay. Even before the Great Peace of Montreal, England had created a rival commercial system around Hudson Bay. In 1670, King Charles II granted the Hudson's Bay Company a charter over Rupert's Land, the enormous drainage basin surrounding Hudson Bay. From coastal posts, such as Moose Factory and York Factory, English merchants exchanged guns, tools, cloth, and other goods for furs carried through established indigenous networks. The company's claim on paper did not mean that it occupied the entire territory. Cree and other indigenous nations remained indispensable traders, guides, and political partners. French merchants responded by extending posts and alliances westward from the St. Lawrence through the Great Lakes, while French expeditions repeatedly challenged English positions around Hudson Bay. By the early 18th century, two rival commercial systems were competing across northern North America. Neither could function without indigenous cooperation, but as European wars crossed the Atlantic, competition over furs hardened into a military struggle for Acadia, the St. Lawrence, and the continent itself. Britain had gained mainland Acadia under the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, but the region remained contested. Most Acadians, French-speaking Catholic farmers, sought neutrality and resisted demands to fight either France or Britain, while Mi'kmaq forces continued defending their own territory and often cooperated with French troops. As fighting between Britain and France intensified in North America, British officials increasingly viewed Acadian neutrality as a security threat. After Fort Beausejour fell in June 1755, and Acadian militiamen were found among its defenders, Nova Scotia's government demanded an unconditional oath of allegiance. When Acadian delegates refused, authorities ordered mass deportation. At Grand Pre, families were confined, placed aboard transport ships, and scattered among Britain's mainland colonies. Homes and farms were destroyed to prevent their return. Nearly 6,000 Acadians were expelled from Nova Scotia in 1755, and thousands more would be displaced before the upheaval ended. The deportation unfolded within a wider imperial war that would soon decide the fate of New France itself. The struggle for North America reached its decisive stage during the 7 Years' War. After capturing the French fortress of Louisbourg in 1758, British forces gained access to the St. Lawrence River and advanced toward Quebec. In September 1759, General James Wolfe led troops up the cliffs outside the city and confronted the army of the Marquis de Montcalm on the Plains of Abraham. The short battle ended in a British victory, while both commanders died from their wounds. Quebec surrendered, but New France did not collapse immediately. French forces defeated the British at Sainte-Foy the following spring, yet failed to retake the city after British ships arrived first. With Montreal surrounded, the colony surrendered in September 1760. Under the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France transferred Canada to Britain. London had conquered the territory, but now faced a difficult question. How could a Protestant British Empire govern tens of thousands of French-speaking Catholic inhabitants? Britain's response to the conquest was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which introduced British institutions and encouraged assimilation. Yet officials soon recognized that an English-speaking Protestant minority could not easily govern roughly 70,000 French-speaking Catholics, especially as unrest increased in the 13 colonies. The Quebec Act of 1774 was a pragmatic compromise. It protected Catholic worship, permitted the Church to collect tithes, and allowed Catholics to hold office without taking the anti-Catholic test oath. It also restored French civil law in private matters, while retaining English criminal law, and expanded Quebec into the Ohio Valley. For the Canadians, the act preserved their religion and legal and social order under British rule. For many American colonists, however, it appeared to favor Catholicism and obstruct Western expansion, so they condemned it as one of the intolerable acts. The compromise helped secure Quebec, but revolution soon transformed British Canada again. When revolution erupted in the 13 colonies, American forces invaded Quebec in 1775, hoping French-speaking Canadians would join their rebellion. The assault on Quebec City failed, however, and the invaders withdrew in 1776. After Britain recognized American independence in 1783, tens of thousands of Loyalists fled north. Many settled in Nova Scotia, helping drive the creation of New Brunswick in 1784, while others established communities along the St. Lawrence River and Great Lakes. The migrants included Black Loyalists and Haudenosaunee allies, such as those led by Joseph Brant, although both groups often faced discrimination, displacement, and broken promises. This influx of English-speaking Protestants transformed the remaining British colonies. In 1791, the Constitutional Act divided Quebec into predominantly English-speaking Upper Canada and French-speaking Lower Canada. Both received elected assemblies, but appointed governors and councils retained substantial power. British Canada had taken shape beside the new United States, but its survival was not yet secure. That insecurity became war in June 1812, when the United States declared war on Britain amid disputes over maritime trade, the impressment of American sailors, and conflict along the western frontier. American armies invaded Upper and Lower Canada, expecting a rapid victory. Instead, British regulars, colonial militia, and First Nations allies stopped them in campaigns that included Detroit, Queenston Heights, and Chateauguay. The Shawnee leader Tecumseh became central to the defense of the western frontier, not to preserve British rule for its own sake, but to build an indigenous confederacy capable of resisting American expansion. His death at the Battle of the Thames in 1813 shattered that hope. The Treaty of Ghent restored the pre-war border in 1814, but offered no protected Indigenous homeland. British Canada survived, strengthening a shared defensive identity, but its Indigenous allies emerged weaker as settlement pressure increased. Military survival, however, did not end demands for political reform. Despite British Canada's survival in the War of 1812, its political system remained dominated by appointed elites. In Upper Canada, the so-called Family Compact controlled government offices, banking, and valuable land, while reformers led by William Lyon Mackenzie demanded an executive accountable to the elected assembly. In Lower Canada, Louis-Joseph Papineau and the Parti Patriote challenged an appointed colonial administration that repeatedly obstructed the French-speaking assembly's authority. Economic hardship, land disputes, and cultural tensions deepened the conflict. After London rejected the Assembly's 92 resolutions in 1837, protests escalated into rebellion. Patriot forces briefly defeated British troops at Saint-Denis but were crushed elsewhere, while Mackenzie's poorly organised uprising near Toronto quickly collapsed. Further incursions in 1838 also failed. Although the rebellions lacked coordination and broad support, their suppression could not resolve the political crisis. Britain therefore sent Lord Durham to investigate, opening the way for a fundamental reorganisation of colonial government. Lord Durham's 1839 report argued that the rebellions had exposed a colonial system unable to command public confidence. He recommended uniting Upper and Lower Canada, partly to assimilate French Canadians, while also urging that executive officials be made accountable to elected representatives. The Act of Union took effect in 1841, uniting Upper Canada and Lower Canada as the Province of Canada. The two sections subsequently became known as Canada West and Canada East. Yet union did not erase French political power. Instead, it encouraged an alliance between French-Canadian reformer Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine and Upper Canadian reformer Robert Baldwin. Their partnership showed that a government could command support across both linguistic sections. In 1848, Governor-General Lord Elgin accepted a reform ministry led by LaFontaine and Baldwin and allowed it to govern while it retained the elected assembly's confidence. Responsible government had finally become political reality. Colonial ministers, rather than appointed governors, now directed domestic affairs. Canada remained within the British Empire, but the foundations of democratic self-government were firmly established. Responsible government gave the colonies control over domestic affairs, but the province of Canada remained trapped in political deadlock as unstable ministries struggled to balance Canada East and Canada West. The American Civil War intensified fears of United States expansion, while colonial leaders sought an intercolonial railway to strengthen trade and defense. In 1864, John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, and George Brown formed the Great Coalition and pursued a wider federal union. Delegates at the Charlottetown and Quebec conferences designed a system that divided authority between a central government and the provinces. The urgency increased in 1866, when Fenian raids exposed the colony's military vulnerability and the United States ended the Reciprocity Treaty, threatening their access to American markets. On July 1, 1867, the British North America Act united Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick as the Dominion of Canada. Confederation created a new country in the East, but its leaders already envisioned expansion toward the Pacific. Confederation gave Canada a foothold in the East, but Prime Minister John A. Macdonald envisioned a dominion stretching to the Pacific. In 1869, Ottawa arranged to acquire Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory, paying the Hudson's Bay Company £300,000 for the surrender of its rights and receiving control of much of present-day Western and Northern Canada. Yet the agreement treated the Northwest as territory to be transferred between distant governments. First Nations and Métis communities living there were not consulted. At the Red River settlement, Canadian surveyors began imposing square townships over a landscape where Métis farms followed narrow river lots. Residents feared losing their land, political voice, French language, Catholic schools, and established way of life. When Ottawa appointed William McDougall lieutenant governor and sent him west without negotiating local guarantees, the transfer became a political crisis. Under Louis Riel, the Métis organized to prevent Canada from taking control on its own terms. Riel's movement quickly became more than a protest. The Métis established a provisional government, occupied Upper Fort Garry, and demanded that Ottawa negotiate before assuming control. Tensions escalated in March 1870 when the Métis provisional government executed Thomas Scott, an English-speaking prisoner, provoking outrage in Ontario and turning Riel into a deeply divisive figure. Even so, Métis delegates secured important concessions. The Manitoba Act created the province of Manitoba in 1870, protected the use of English and French in its legislature and courts, recognized denominational school rights, and reserved 1.4 million acres for the children of Métis families. Yet Ottawa granted Riel no immediate amnesty, and he fled when the Wolseley expedition reached Red River. Delays, speculation, and mismanagement later prevented many Métis families from receiving the land they had expected, driving thousands farther west. Canada had gained a new province, but connecting its eastern colonies to the Pacific now required a transcontinental railway. Canada's expansion toward the Pacific required more than acquiring territory. British Columbia joined Confederation in 1871 after Ottawa promised a transcontinental railway linking the colony to eastern Canada. To make settlement and railway construction possible, the federal government negotiated Treaties 1 through 7 with First Nations between 1871 and 1877. Ottawa treated these agreements as the surrender of vast territories. while many Indigenous negotiators understood them as lasting commitments to share the land and receive reserves, annuities, assistance, and continued hunting and fishing rights. The Dominion Lands Act of 1872 then offered 160-acre homesteads to settlers, dividing prairie lands through a new survey system. In 1876, the Indian Act placed First Nations status, reserve lands, and band governance under sweeping federal authority. Railways, homesteads, treaties, and administrative control thus became parts of one continental project. Yet building a railway across mountains and plains would require enormous capital, dangerous labor, and political resolve. After years of delay and political scandal, the Canadian Pacific Railway was incorporated in 1881, and construction accelerated from both ends of the country. Survey crews crossed the prairies, while workers blasted tunnels and cut ledges through the mountains of British Columbia. More than 10,000 Chinese laborers arrived between 1881 and 1885 to work on the western section. They were generally paid less than white workers, lived in harsh conditions, and faced deadly explosions, rock slides, disease, and exhaustion. Hundreds died. By early 1885, the railway was still unfinished, but enough track existed to move militia and supplies west, far faster than previous transportation routes allowed. That capability suddenly became decisive in present-day Saskatchewan, where Métis communities had spent years asking Ottawa to recognize their river lot farms and political rights. When their petitions brought no adequate settlement, frustration turned into resistance, and the railway became the instrument through which the government answered it. In 1884, Métis leaders invited Louis Riel to return from Montana and help present their demands to Ottawa. When the government again failed to resolve their land claims and political grievances, Riel and military leader Gabriel Dumont established a provisional government at Batoche in March 1885. Fighting began at Duck Lake, where Métis forces defeated the Northwest Mounted Police. Several Cree and Nakota communities also resisted starvation, coercive reserve policies, and unfulfilled treaty commitments, although their grievances and leaders remained distinct from Riel's movement. Government troops transported west along the unfinished railway eventually overwhelmed the Métis at Batoche. In May, Riel surrendered, was convicted of high treason in Regina, and was hanged on November 16 despite widespread appeals for clemency, especially from Quebec. His execution deepened divisions between French and English Canada, while Ottawa's victory allowed the federal government to impose even tighter control over Indigenous lands, movement, and children. Victory in 1885 strengthened Ottawa's control over the West. Federal officials imposed an extra-legal pass system that restricted First Nations people from leaving reserves, while government-backed residential schools expanded during the 1880s to separate Indigenous children from their families, languages, and cultures. On November 7, 1885, the last spike completed the Canadian Pacific Railway, opening a faster route for settlers, grain, and state authority. Yet that same year, the Chinese Immigration Act imposed a $50 head tax on Chinese arrivals after their labor had helped build the line. After 1896, Immigration Minister Clifford Sifton aggressively recruited farmers from the United States, Britain, and Eastern and Central Europe. The Chinese head tax reached $500 in 1903. Alberta and Saskatchewan became provinces in 1905, and the Continuous Journey Regulation of 1908 effectively obstructed immigration from India. By 1914, Canada was larger, wealthier, and more diverse, but its expansion rested on dispossession and racial exclusion as Europe approached war. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, Canada entered the First World War automatically because it did not yet control its own foreign policy. More than 620,000 Canadians eventually served. At the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, Canadian troops held their position despite Germany's first large-scale chlorine gas attack. In April 1917, all 4 Canadian divisions fought together at Vimy Ridge, capturing a heavily defended position in a victory that later became a national symbol. Yet the war's mounting casualties led Prime Minister Robert Borden to introduce conscription in 1917, provoking fierce opposition in Quebec and deepening divisions between French and English Canadians. More than 60,000 Canadian service members died. Canada's contribution strengthened its demand for international recognition, allowing it to sign the Treaty of Versailles separately and join the League of Nations. Canada had entered the war as a British dominion, but emerged determined to control its own foreign affairs. Canada's new international status marked a major step toward legislative and constitutional independence. At the 1926 Imperial Conference, Britain and the Dominions were recognized as equal communities within the British Empire, and the Statute of Westminster in 1931 granted Canada legislative autonomy. Yet this new autonomy arrived amid economic crisis. The Great Depression devastated farms and cities, exposing weak relief systems and increasing pressure for a stronger federal role. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, Canada did not enter automatically. Parliament debated the question and issued its own declaration on September 10. More than 1 million Canadians served during the Second World War, while factories produced ships, aircraft, vehicles, and munitions on an unprecedented scale. Canadian forces suffered heavily at Hong Kong and Dieppe, then fought through Italy, landed at Juno Beach, and helped liberate the Netherlands. Victory in 1945 left Canada more autonomous, industrialized, and internationally influential, but also ready for sweeping changes at home. After 1945, Canada transformed wartime prosperity into a broader social and economic expansion. Returning veterans received education, housing, and business assistance, while the baby boom accelerated suburban growth. Federal family allowances began in 1945, and later programs expanded unemployment insurance, pensions, and public health care. Immigration also reshaped the country as displaced Europeans arrived after the war, and discriminatory racial restrictions were gradually dismantled. In 1947, the Canadian Citizenship Act created a distinct Canadian citizenship, and 2 years later, Newfoundland joined Confederation as the 10th province. At the same time, Canada aligned itself firmly with the United States and Western Europe, becoming a founding member of NATO and sending troops to the Korean War. Yet prosperity was uneven, and older cultural hierarchies remained powerful. Nowhere was this tension more visible than in Quebec, where a conservative, church-dominated society was approaching a political and cultural transformation known as the Quiet Revolution.